start by introducing yourself from where you come from.
Okay. Well, so I am originally born and raised in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is this vast swath of land that goes from the north to the south of the state. And even though you say San Joaquin Valley or you say Central Valley throughout the United States, and people will pretty much go like, I don't know, but chances are they're eating something that came from there. Is also known as the breadbasket of America. Some of the things that the San Joaquin Valley is known for um, are things like the UFW, so the United Farm Workers Union, or more specifically, people will understand the name Cesar Chavez as having something to do with something important in liberation. Um, the insiders know that you should not invoke the name Cesar Chavez without also giving credit to Dolores Huerta, who was the co-founder of the UFW and fought for the rights of many people, farm workers especially. But one of the reasons that that is so amazing was that these were people who were American citizens as well as people who were not citizens, and they rose together and were powerful together. Um, if you're a Steinbeck fan, The Grapes of Wrath talks all about the immigration of Dust Bowl migrants coming from the center of the United States, from Oklahoma and into California. And that's where I was reared, among the offspring and the generations after these Dust Bowl migrants, and then the migrant farm workers coming from the South, from Mexico. That's a little bit about my family. So it's been really wonderful to move throughout life with this kind of understanding of being myself a bridge, where I have an insider outsider perspective. I can go throughout the nation. I've traveled heavily across the United States, specifically in the Midwest, and had this understanding with people, this kind of kinship with people that happens when you grow up in this kind of singular place, which is the San Joaquin Valley, where you've got such a complex history, not all of it pretty, but definitely complex. And specifically in regard to art, I love being a herald of what the San Joaquin Valley has contributed. Because as I've traveled the world, when people ask me where I'm from, a lot of times I'll say California, because California is this kind of known thing. Even within, if you said certain states, maybe people wouldn't know, but okay, California, I understand California. But there's a tendency to kind of um, equate California with being Los Angeles, or maybe with being San Francisco. And so I think that it's one of my duties as a daughter of the San Joaquin Valley to talk about some of the contributions that have come out of there, specifically in art, that maybe people don't give us credit for. Some of the insiders know about the Bakersfield sound, so Buck Owens and country music. So that is definitely a known quantity to people who are interested in country and Western music. And it's not surprising to a lot of people who have ideas about the Central Valley, Bakersfield in particular, that maybe they haven't investigated. But some of the things that are surprising to people is that the first feminist art program came out of the San Joaquin Valley. So specifically, Judy Chicago started a feminist art program at Fresno State. And it's been a real privilege of mine to come in as a lecturer at UCLA and to talk about those things, and to have people within the art department not know that, and then to see some of my first generation students who are coming from these areas that are often talked about as being at backwater and backwards, to kind of sit up and straighten up in their chair like, yeah, that's where I'm from, where the first feminist art program happened. And then to have them teach me things that I didn't even know. So recently I learned from one of my world arts and culture students at UCLA that popping, which is a kind of dance form, came out of the San Joaquin Valley as well. So I'm proud to be a herald of, of that part of the country. Um, it's ag based. It's not a tourist place. You don't go there if you don't have folks there or something to do. Uh, and for many places like Bakersfield, where I'm specifically from, I like to say it's not a small town, but it doesn't know that. So don't tell it. It still kind of has that feel. So it's wonderful to come from that background and juxtapose that with my current environment, which of course is the great city of Los Angeles and has been for the last 17 years. This has been where I've worked. This has been where I've collaborated, and this has been home.
Well, that's a great backdrop, Marisa. When I met you, you somehow clearly had a Bakersfield kind of feel about you. I don't know how to describe that. Maybe it
Was
was.
it the red cowboy boots?
I think so. I think so. Yeah, for sure. And being an East Coast guy, the Bakersfield thing is just a huge thing for some of us. But as we dig deeper into the Central Valley and what that really means, and I've done that, over the course of a number of years living here in Los Angeles, it's a deeper, deeper thing, and it goes way beyond country music and you know Buck Owens and Merle Haggard and the rest of it. But but there's some deeper stuff up there, and you've been deeply engaged in that clearly, and then you've you know morphed into the Los Angeles thing, whatever that means. And you and I know each other through our interactions through Otis College of Art and Design, and that's just been a gift to say the least. Um, can you talk about some of the work that you've done? I mean, talk about your journey. Maybe let's try this. Let's talk about your journey as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
You come out of, the Central Valley
Mm-hmm.
and wherever you come from that. And you come out of that and you intersect with, I'm skipping pieces, so fill in the blanks. You intersect with Otis, College of Art and Design, Suzanne Lacey, and other influencers, and you return to the Valley.
Mm-hmm.
That's my understanding. Can you talk about that?
Love to. So in the kind of Reader's Digest version, I grew up um, with some pretty progressive parents and a pretty progressive family. My whole family, children of immigrants, are educators and lawyers. So there wasn't anything you could say at my grandmother's table without justification. So that idea of like you're entitled to your opinion, I didn't grow up with that. You always had to justify what you were saying. Um, and so I moved away initially when I was 18. I moved to Colorado. I took a gap year after high school because I knew I wasn't ready for college. And I traveled around the Midwest working with something called the National Civilian Community Corps. And I had a lot of different projects, working with a lot of different nonprofits, working with the Red Cross, working with FEMA. And every single time it seemed like I was finding something artistic to do. So whereas before art had been this sort of like thing that I seemed to have a knack for and I was building skills in, but like, could I take it seriously? I realized like, actually, I'm taking this pretty seriously. So I returned to Bakersfield, went to Bakersfield College, took all of my foundational studies there with the same teachers that taught my father right before they retired. So he got them when they were new, and I got them right before they retired in Bakersfield. And at that point, I was pretty convinced like, okay, this art thing, it's not going away. I seem to be taking it seriously, time to invest. So that's when I moved to LA and I went to Otis College of Art and Design. At the time, the fine art department chair was a woman named Suzanne Lacey. who is from Tulare, California, which is very close to Bakersfield in the San Joaquin Valley. So we bonded over sort of our working class background and being from these similar types of communities. And she asked me as a student to participate in her community work in Elkhorn City, Kentucky, which is in the Appalachian Mountains. So they were doing some work in the Appalachian Trail. She'd been working with this small community, very rural. There was one stoplight, there was one cop, but he was also the chief of police there. So that worked out for them. But all that to say that it was a very small community where the coal industry had come and gone. She'd been working with them for years, and that community, Elkhorn, decided one of the things they really, really wanted were some murals. And they wanted the murals in their downtown. And when you go to downtown Elkhorn, you see again a place where things have been, but there's not so much in the present. So what I was able to do as an artist was to project the memories that everyone had of that community onto the very walls where the memories were had occurred. So we took some photos out of their archive and I made an 11-foot mural of what the downtown was on the downtown with some other women artists. Funny aside is that there were some rumors around the community that there were these gals from LA who were making art, and that attracted some attention. So we had some people come in to kind of like looky-loos and be like, all right, like who are these city slicker gals who are coming into our city? And I had a gentleman come in with a trucker's cap and rolled up in his truck, and he said to me, as I'm painting, he said, "Hey, you ever seen a real live hillbilly?" And I said, "Brother, I am from Bakersfield." And he said, "Buck Owen Street's in Bakersfield." And that there's like this kinship, like I said, of knowing that, okay, this person is a person who comes from a community with which there are strong ties all around the United States. And it's kind of unpacking those ties that has been one of the great joys of my life. So fast forward a couple of years after working with Suzanne Lacey in Elkhorn City, she was now the chair of a graduate program and brought me in to help facilitate this dual city program with Los Angeles, graduate students in Los Angeles, and the community of Layton, California, which is right in the center of the San Joaquin Valley. And so I think one of the reasons that I was hired for this position was because I knew how to take the heat, the literal 110-degree heat that happened in the summer when we were doing that project. So we were able to serve the San Joaquin community again and kind of come full circle, though our circle has not completely ended. Suzanne and I are very lively people. We've got a lot of life in us left, a long relationship, but I asked her to be part of one of my art projects. So I got a fellowship through the Women's Building to go through their archive and make some art inspired by it. And I was really inspired by this idea of women mentoring women. Within my own art practice, I rarely ever create anything that isn't heavily heavily influenced by conversations with other women. So I decided to record some of these conversations and brought mentors and mentees into the same room and recorded their conversations. And she agreed to talk to me. So she became an integral part of that, where our conversation about mentorship revolved around the idea of bringing someone into equity. So it's not a passing down of knowledge, but it's a bringing into equity, an eye-to-eye conversation. But that's just a little Reader's Digest version of my relationship with Suzanne and how it started and where it's at.
No, it's, I mean, it's Suzanne Lacey, such great work that she's done. And that's a great homage to her as well. And also to you and your sense of place.
I
because
love bringing it with me. It goes with me everywhere, whether I acknowledge it or not.
yeah,
So
yeah, and for our teacher educator based audience out there, I think that what is most important is this idea of connecting to place.
Mhm, mhm.
And it might be in some cases, sure, the Bakersfield sound, when we some of us understand that, you know but there's more to that. There's also the Okie resonance that goes before that, Merle Haggard, and before that, and then there's also what some of us would read through books like the King of California, is the whole like import of the Southern agricultural, uh, you know, cotton industry, if we will, and the Central Valley is a very complicated place. It's a
And
complicated place,
and
it's very representative of a lot of other American quote unquote complicated places.
mhm.
And I don't know if you want to comment on that, great, and then kind of move on from
Well,
there.
I think it's more diverse than people
Yeah,
recognize, that
that's right.
area. It's almost as if the history of it kind of got like, okay, yeah, that, something to do with Steinbeck, and then it just all sort of stayed there. So, I'm happy to be a torchbearer and carry that forward. Even though as I do in this conversation, I feel like I'm talking like a carnival barker really fast.
No, I think the got stuck with Steinbeck is a great comment.
Mm, mhm.
So why don't you like move off that?
Oh, so, I'm I think one of the things that I don't want to get away from this point without pointing out is that I didn't move to LA to like gain culture. Like I moved to Los Angeles with culture. Um, I was heavily involved as a youth with the Bakersfield Community Theater, which was the longest continuing running theater west of the Mississippi. And it was in the community theater that I cultivated all of these artistic skills. I started with performance, but
Can,
my
can I
teachers, my
can I
theater,
can I pause you there? I
yeah.
mean, okay, you just said that the theater was the longest unpaused theater west
Mm,
of the Mississippi. Can you
mhm.
unpack that a little bit?
It's just a small theater. Like when people think about community theater, this is actually like what they have in mind, where it's not just like a select group of people who are like paid to do theater. This is all volunteer work. This is people who do it because they love it. This is people who volunteer not only to produce plays but also to teach young children and imbue them with all of that skill and idealism that comes with being a theater artist. And for me personally, uh, I was mentored through all kinds of skills through theater. So even though my dad had carpentry skills, because I was a daughter instead of a son, he didn't pass them on to me. It was my theater instructor who said, "We need a set," and gave me some tools. So it should be noted that I currently make my living in the creativity lab, putting tools in students' hands and teaching them how to use um, anything from like hand tools like hammers and pliers to things like drill presses and scroll saws. And it was my theater teacher who first introduced me to those tools. So it was Bakersfield Community Theater, where I would wander through the dressing rooms and be like, oh, that's interesting. This thing that's been here since the 60s, these discarded clothes that they picked up at a yard sale that are actually, you know, an amazing vintage quality, and seeing how you can dress somebody in period dress and completely change their persona, storytelling. All of these skills were things that I learned in the theater. And my inclination now as an adult toward installation art really happened from making sets in the theater, where I learned, okay, I'm going to walk in, there are going to be sight lines. What's the impact going to be for the person walking into the theater? I want it to be wow. So translate that 30 years into the future, where I'm, you know, installing things in a space, I'm changing the space, I'm solving spatial problems all the time. And that really happened in the theater. So I was able to move from there, take the knowledge that I got from there, again, from my great teachers at the Bakersfield College, and really plant it in Los Angeles. So not to make it, not to step away from that, but to bring that, if that makes sense.
Somewhere in there is like the great influence of your dad with the swing a hammer, right?
Oh yeah, my parents, my sister and I joke that we raised very artistic parents, because I will give them full credit for really emphasizing the intrinsic value of art history, and taking us to museums and making us proud of our culture through our knowledge of, like, the greats, you know. Um, and by that I was referring to, like, Diego Rivera and Orozco and Frida Kahlo. We knew them from a very young age. But with theater, my sister was actually the first
How
thespian.
how how did you know them from a young age? Talk about that.
So I think that as working class people, there always needed to be a justification for anything that you did that might be considered luxury or leisure. And so anytime we went on a vacation, it always included museums. Like, there was going to be some kind of educational component of your vacation. So it was museums. I remember specifically at LACMA, they did a show called The Treasures of Mexico. And I was young, but my sister was a little bit older. And she says she remembers having that feeling of, like, being reflected back in a grandiose way for the first time, and it really changing her perception of self. Now, for me, since I was very young, I had that early enough that I don't remember not having it. I was just like, yep, this is who we are. So I want to speak to how important that is, um, to reflect people, to represent people, to include all of the narratives. Uh, so that was really, I think, a kind of a seminal moment for us to see that and to know that, and then it just, you know, became our day to day. It was who we were.
Sure, and it's I think it's kind of a given that um, Rivera and Frida and Orozco and Sierras were not like givens in the American lexicon by
Not
any.
at the time. We grew up in the 80s.
Right,
Grew up in
right.
the 80s, where actually, if you said you were Mexican American, I think the image that was conjured was Edward James Olmos. So
Sure.
dominant narrative of what is a Mexican American came out of East Los Angeles.
Like,
And for me to know that I had this sort of rich heritage of the
well,
labor movement and of
to,
um,
to
all
put
of the people who were bending in the fields, I was like, this is not being represented. This story is not being told. So it's interesting for me to now find myself uh, heavily invested in the community of Los Angeles, East Los Angeles in present day, where as I came from Bakersfield, I was like, there's something there. I got to respect that, but I don't understand it. And so it became a quest to kind of be like, all right, I need to respect this and understand this more. So it's been amazing for me to actually be embraced by that community and to work with that community. Um, but I want to get back to one specific point that I made
But
so that it doesn't go misunderstood, is that my sister was the first thespian. So nobody had done theater in my family, really. Um, and then she pulled me in. She was my first director. And then we together pulled our parents in to do sets and props and those kinds of things. And then we moved away. We moved to different cities. Like I said, I moved to Colorado, and they stayed in the theater and they started to do that thing that I'm talking about reflecting the community that was there. Because to that point, all of the plays that were being produced were from and they were white. There's no other way to say it. It was just not reflective of what the community looked like. So it was my mother, Maria Mercado, who said, why don't we do a Josefina Lopez play, Real Women Have Curves? And she was told, who are you going to get to audition for that? No one's going to come to that. That play had to extend the run at the Bakersfield Community Theater because it was standing room only. People were just coming in droves. There were standing ovations all the time because it was the first time that a play had been produced where people were like, hey, like this is a story about us. This is a story about um, migrants or immigrants. Um, which, to make the connection to East Los Angeles, is interesting because that's where it was set, in Boyle Heights. And yet there was this connection for the people of Bakersfield to say, that is us. Well, so now they've gotten some awards, my parents, for the work that they've done. And this is kind of a constant. It's been an understood thing ever since this sort of um, hinge moment, that these stories need to be told in Bakersfield, that there is an audience for it, that there are people who will play those parts. Um, I personally had the privilege of sitting on a panel with Josefina Lopez recently and talked about that very thing. So, like I said, it's been a wonderful experience for me to go from being in a particular place in California with a particular kind of complicated history and bringing that with me, within me, and then planting myself and rooting myself in Los Angeles and working with the community that I had heard so much about through popular media, that I heard so many wrong things about through popular media in the 80s and 90s, and to have kind of that coming together, if that makes sense.
back to the beginning of your comments, I think as far as Edward James Olmos goes, I think he's got a legendary, you know, history of great accomplishment, and yet it also comes down to certain films that he's made, and that's not his fault. But I think that, you know, what you're talking about is the larger implications.
Well,
And
it comes down to who controls the mechanism of storytelling, right?
it's correct, absolutely.
So even though some of the stories that were coming out, uh, you know, there were elements of truth to them in the 80s and the 90s. They were still from this kind of like very masculine perspective, for example. And for me as a female, it was like it was hard to be identified with something, but also not feel like I identified with that thing that people were identifying me as,
Right.
right? So I needed to push back against that and go like, wait, there's more to the story here. So I think that there have been these kinds of torchbearers like Josefina Lopez, like myself, who go, all right, let's let's move on. Like, we've got to tell our stories. We've got to empower other people to tell their stories. So to bring that into perspective with my teaching practice, I tell my students when I teach storytelling, this is really important. No, this is critical stuff for you to know, because if you can't tell your own story, there are other people who are willing to tell their version of it and make money off of it and represent you in a really terrible way. And that representation embeds in other people's minds. And at least it's inconveniencing because you get followed around Best Buy, people expect you to steal things. But at worst, it could actually get you killed, because people are going to see you, they're going to identify you as something that you're not, and that's going to make them think that you're dangerous and put your life in peril. So the storyteller is really important. And for myself, I focus on telling the stories of female bodies, of brown bodies, and then also passing on what I've learned from the people who've taught me about storytelling and from my own life to my students, and telling them I can tell my own stories and my own perspective all day, but what will be really interesting is what you have to say.
So, Manisa, if you could talk about your experiences with your students, and I would encourage you to generalize, but you know, you've had a lot of different students over the years. From now to then,
Mm,
talk about the ways in which you've been able to engage students in the importance of storytelling.
mm.
You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
I
Oh yeah.
mean, there are ways that work and ways that don't, and we know this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And how have you been most successful, generality or otherwise, in getting students to engage in real interest and passion and storytelling of their family, of their community, of their whatever?
Mm-hmm.
How's that?
Um, Speaking in generalities,
Yep.
I think that it's important to realize that I am not giving students a voice. They already have a voice. They're learning to tell a story. And a lot of that just has to do with honestly asking them questions. So there have been many times where, you present a question to a class and just all of these things gush out of them, because to this point, and I'm speaking about adolescents here, middle schoolers and high school students, nobody's bothered to ask them. They've been presented with perspectives. They've been told, or at least alluded to strongly, what the right perspectives to have are. Uh, but very few people have asked them what their perspective is. Um, Also, I would say making examples culturally relevant. So I have my own philosophy that there are a lot of things that are important in art history that people will probably be exposed to. So I don't need to go over, the majors and the greatest hits. But if I can expose them to themselves in a way, uh, by exposing them to an example of an artist that I'm not sure somebody else is going to tell them about, um, that's an important way to connect. I can't overstate how much I believe that conversations about art are really a gift for anybody who is acquiring language skills, and that goes for people for whom are working in a first or second language or other, is that oftentimes when a student who's working in a second language is in a classroom, they're presented with this impossible, not impossible, but incredibly challenging task of like, I want you to answer this question about a specific topic, be it history or math or what have you. And I want you to do it in another language. So then you have to think about the fact that like, okay, if I'm going to speak up right now, I need to process within seconds what is the correct answer. So I have to have the correct answer to that question. And I also have to figure out the right words to say it in. And people are looking at me and going, do it now. Versus having conversations with students about art where the question is open-ended and you're just like, what do you see? What do you think? What is important to you? That's not a trick question. And I've had to emphasize this to students over and over. They have to unlearn that there is a right answer. They've learned that there's a right answer in teacher's head. And if I don't have it, I don't get to speak up. So when I present them with this exercise of tell me what stands out to you, what is important to you, at first they think it's a trick question. But over time, they learn, no, I'm actually interested in what you think of this, what you notice. And so then there isn't that quality of having to worry about what the right answer is. Now all I have to do is I have to come up with the words that best express what I notice or how I feel about that or what that's making me think of. So there's a sort of freedom that comes from discussions about art that then can be parlayed into conversations about justifying your opinion. Okay, I see that you noticed that, that stands out to you. Why does it stand out to you? Oh, well, because of the colors. And so we're doing these things in all of these kind of more accessible ways. But what we're actually doing is we're learning critical thinking. And then they can take those ideas about justification, critical thought, and they can express themselves with a brand new set of colors. And we're not even talking about the technical skills of making art, right? We're just talking about talking. So I don't know if I'm being too abstract here, but these are some of the things that are core to my practice, is that I would not say that I am an art teacher, even though it's how I made my bread and butter for close to 2 decades. It's that I am a teacher of critical thought and of problem solving and of collaboration and communication. And I use art as a vehicle for students to learn about themselves.
Well, I'll check in here with a comment really quickly. You're totally on target, and I think this is what our audience of educators want to hear about. Um, you know, I think that what you're talking about really is trying to reach a broader and a narrow group of kids
Mm,
at the same time,
mm,
and that's what we all face as educators. And I think the idea that you're submitting here is that there is no simple answer to this, and that those who think there is are seriously misguided. And I think that it's incredibly important to pay attention to what you're talking about with offering students an opportunity for a wide variety of opportunities to represent themselves.
mm,
And if we don't do that, I humbly think we failed. And and that's what it seems to me you're arguing for. An opportunity for students to represent themselves.
mm-hmm. And
in whatever way that may be. And the more we are able to offer them creative opportunities to do that within, you know, the ways that the totality of representative education, whatever that may be, represents. I mean, that seems to be the key here. I'm not sure I stated that clearly. Can you bounce off that?
I
Teresa?
I think one of the things that it spurred on to me is in order to be responsive educators, which is key, like not just being like, okay, I have my curriculum and it worked that time, so it's going to work every single time. But in order to be responsive educators with students who are it's important to challenge them without like, it's hard to say. I'm trying to think of a concrete example, is to not be like, like, don't do that, right? Don't do that. But instead to challenge them to take it further. So I'll give an example of working again with some adolescents who just wanted to like scroll some in a school that was, I don't have a problem with cussing, but I knew that it would get them in trouble to include cussing in, you know, their artwork. And instead of saying like, oh no, you can't do that because it's not allowed, what I presented them with is like, how can you take this further? Or what's the thought behind that? Because this is a really simple statement, and it's not that I disagree with it, but what's behind that? What does it mean? Like, why? Like, why would you say that? And then there's just this whole flood of words that comes out of them for their justification for why they feel that way that nobody has ever bothered to ask them. They've only been corrected instead of challenged. That's I think I figured out how to say it simply.
No,
Um,
I exactly. It's like a fulfillment of dialogue.
mm,
It was not present before. It was a superficial extension of what do you think?
mhm, mhm,
No, I understand completely what you're saying. And so you've seen this happen at its best.
mhm. Uh,
And yeah,
and I think it's important to also put in there that that's all well and good, and those are things that can happen in the realm of storytelling and those types of classes. But I don't want to leave our educators who aren't in kind of narrative craft out.
right.
I want to loop in the practice that I have now, which is to teach in a kind of STEAM lab. So bringing in science and engineering and mathematics, and what do those have to do with the arts? So again, it gets down to this idea of, if I can draw a through line of the open-ended question, right? So a student goes into a math class, for example, and they don't have the right answer. There's an equation and it's going to make one particular answer. And if you don't have that one particular answer, then you failed at the equation. Now, we can still talk to students in terms of, this was a good try. We're going to praise you for trying. Mistakes are nothing to be ashamed of, but that's harder to do when there's one answer that if you don't get correct, you've missed entirely. Whereas when you are approaching art from this kind of scientific method of trial and error, then students come to understand that there is a great deal they can learn from a quote unquote mistake. And that by the end of the term, there actually is no such thing as a mistake, because they come to realize that, all right, I tried something. The outcome was not what I predicted it would be, but I learned how to do this other thing along the way. And also to learn that there are multiple answers to any given question. So I present artistic problems, spatial problems, material problems, and then the students learn through experimentation that they can come up with an answer that is correct, that the other student in the class can come up with an entirely different answer that is also correct, that satisfies the problem, that their answer can be totally different from teacher's answer, and they can still be correct. So this idea that like, just because I don't have your answer doesn't mean that I have the wrong answer, as well as this idea that your answer that is different than mine is not a threat. So to work against this sort of cultural narrative of competition, and instead foster this environment of collaboration. So it's not about you doing better than me, you're doing different than me, and that's totally fine. In fact, it's a gift because at some point in the class, usually at the midpoint and at the end of class, we'll talk about the different answers that people are working out for themselves spatially and with material. And I'll say, can somebody tell us about some experiment that they're working on and how it's going, even if it's going really badly. Maybe if it's going badly, we've got some ideas for you. And sure enough, there'll be somebody who'll be like, I can't make mine stand up. And there will be a third person who will go like, oh, that was happening to me. And then I cut it and I bent it. And that's how I got mine to stand up. And then there'll be a fourth person who will say like, I just used this other material to kind of bolster it. And so we, through this education of art, are educating them on the idea that the group is stronger than the individual. I tell them, one of you is so smart. And think about how smart we are when we've got one that's so smart, another one that's so smart, another one that's so smart. We put all of those brains together and we're a genius. There's nothing that we can't solve together. Um, so I think that that's another key component that we have when we're working through art to educate, is this idea that we can foster collaboration, and that through collaboration we can put aside this idea of competition. It's me versus them. I'm all alone in this, to go, actually, if I work to understand their perspective, it strengthens my perspective.
You've been an amazing interpreter to that. Can you talk about some of that?
So
That's a big project. I understand. Two different things.
So some of the conversations that I was just speaking about having with students about problem solving and collaboration
Yeah.
and material, those are definitely conversations that I've had in the creativity lab. So those, for the benefit of our viewers, those students are usually like elementary school through middle school.
Yeah.
And I've been working with adults for basically the total of my career, because I started in museum education. And in museum education, you get self-select audiences of mostly adults with a few children. So fast forward to present day, where I'm with my second cohort of VAPE students. That's the Visual and Performing Arts Education Program. So these are students who are mostly coming from an art background, who are thinking about teaching. And I'm taking them through 3/4 of going from theory to practicum, where they're putting together their curriculum, and then implementation in the third quarter, which is where I have my cohort now. So they go from, these are a lot of ideas, foundational ideas about education and arts education specifically. This is how I want to interpret those with my own ideas and my own identity, and craft something for people. And then third quarter to actually serve those people. But some of the things that I've been talking about in Creativity Lab, of course, they translate into our conversations as adults. So this idea of like, we're all here together and everybody brings in knowledge. It's fascinating to see how many students make it all the way to the collegiate level and go like, wait, like I'm supposed to talk in here. I'm creating the learning environment and experience too. Like, wow. Um, and just like with the creativity lab, my personal philosophy is that it becomes less of me and more of them. So even though they're entirely different kinds of things that we're doing, we have one set of adults who are making lessons for students, and on the other hand, in the creativity lab, we have students who are making, small sculptures. Um, at Inner City Arts, that's still sort of the same kind of thrust. So at Inner City Arts, my objective is for the students to have freedom at the end, and the belief in themselves, self-efficacy enough to make whatever they want. So we'll start the session, which is 8 or 9 weeks, talking about things that they can make choices on, but they're going to get similar outcomes. And the further down those weeks we get in the term, the more dissimilar their outcomes become, right? So they're getting to make more choices. And then you get all the way to the end of the term, the last couple of classes. And I say, I don't know what we're going to make. You tell me. I mean, you are obviously such a creative person. We've worked together for so long. Now I know that you're full of ideas and you have all of these great ways and methods that we've talked about together. Use whatever technique you want and make whatever you want. And it's like, what? Really? Wow. I had a classroom teacher whisper to me on that last day when the students had their free build day. You said we were going to have a free build and you explained it to me how that was going to work, but I didn't believe you at the time. I never would have believed this was possible to look around, and that time we were physically in the same room, students using tools, being really concentrated on what they were doing it safely, not doing it in a way that was dangerous to each other because they were competing for objects or ideas. Um, and that's what it can look like when you're making sculpture. But it's akin to what happens in the UCLA class, because now in this third quarter, it's about them creating content that they are sharing with the world, that they're sharing with the class. They're guiding the discussions, they're facilitating the warm-ups. It's less about what I have to show and model to them, and more about what they have decided is important to bring to the table.
So, so it sounds like, Marisa, it sounds like you've learned like similar overriding lessons from K to 12 to the higher ed kids.
We're not so dissimilar, and
No,
I
no,
think that
no, no.
if we allowed ourselves to see that, we'd be a lot better off in both cases. There's so many things that when young people are allowed to do
Yeah,
safely, or allowed to inquire about
yeah,
safely, they can pull off.
yeah,
And there are so many things that as adults, if we gave ourselves permission to still investigate the way we did as
right,
children, that we'd have a far easier time as well.
yeah. Well, that's a that's a great place to close somehow, because I think those of us that have experienced this with students know how true that is.
Mm, mhm.
And I just want to thank you tremendously for sharing your wisdom and expertise.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. We could talk all day.
We could, and we would, but we'll stop for now. And I want to thank you so much for giving giving of your time.
Thanks, Joe.
And I think this is wisdom for many of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We will see you soon.